The crisp autumn wind sweeping through Oakhaven Valley carried the scent of dying corn and impending ruin. It was the kind of wind that whispered of foreclosures and shattered generational legacies. When the sleek black town car belonging to First Agrarian Trust rolled up Albert Pendleton's dirt driveway, the executives inside thought they were arriving to slaughter a lamb. They had the paperwork, the lawyers, and the eviction notices neatly stacked in leather briefcases. They expected tears, desperate begging, or perhaps a warning shot from a rusted 12-gauge. What they didn't expect was to find Albert sitting on his porch, sipping lukewarm black coffee, with a devastating, quiet smile on his weathered face. He was the only farmer in the county who had ever bothered to read the fine print. The Pendleton family had bled into the soil of Oakhaven, Nebraska, for over 4 generations. Albert Pendleton's great-grandfather had broken the prairie with a horse-drawn plow. His grandfather had held the line through the suffocating dust storms of the 1930s, and his father had survived the brutal farm crisis of the 1980s by the skin of his teeth. To Albert, the 300 acres of rolling amber fields were not just property. They were a living, breathing testament to his family's endurance. The farmhouse, with its peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that groaned underfoot, was a museum of quiet American resilience. But resilience, as Albert was painfully learning, could not pay off a modern agricultural loan. The trouble had not started overnight. It was a slow, agonizing tightening of a noose woven from corporate greed, unpredictable weather, and skyrocketing equipment costs. In 2021, a brutal, relentless drought had scorched the Midwest, turning Albert's promising corn and soybean yields into brittle, lifeless husks. To survive the season and prep for the next, Albert had been forced to upgrade his failing irrigation systems and repair a massive John Deere combine that had finally given up the ghost. Traditional local banks had long since been swallowed up by massive financial conglomerates, leaving Albert no choice but to walk into the sterile, glass-walled offices of First Agrarian Trust. First Agrarian Trust was a monolithic entity headquartered in Chicago, a bank that viewed farmers not as partners, but as entries on a sprawling spreadsheet. The regional director overseeing Oakhaven was a man named Harrison Croft. Croft was a man who had never had dirt under his fingernails. He wore bespoke Italian suits, drove a silver German sedan, and spoke in a clipped, sterile jargon of asset liquidation, yield optimization, and collateral restructuring. When Albert had sat across from Croft 3 years prior, cap in hand, asking for the bridge loan to save his harvest, Croft had slid a stack of documents across the mahogany desk that was thicker than a phone book. "Standard operating procedure, Mr. Pendleton," Croft had said, his voice as smooth and cold as river glass. "It's a comprehensive collateralization agreement. We are taking a risk on you given your recent yield deficits, but we believe in supporting the agricultural backbone of America. Sign at the tabs." Albert, desperate to keep the lights on and the tractors running, had signed where the yellow sticky notes pointed. He had secured the loan. For 2 years, he fought like a dog, working 80-hour weeks, praying for rain and pinching every penny. But the market prices for soybeans crashed. Fertilizer costs tripled due to global supply chain collapses, and the margins shrank to nothing. By the late fall of 2023, Albert was behind. Not by much, at first just 30 days late on a quarterly payment. But First Agrarian Trust was a predator that smelled blood in the water. They didn't offer grace periods or restructuring. They triggered penalty clauses. The interest rate spiked. Late fees compounded upon late fees. Within 6 months, a manageable deficit had ballooned into an unscalable mountain of debt. Albert's wife, Clara, a woman whose gentle spirit masked a spine of absolute steel, watched the toll it took on her husband. She saw the deepening lines around his eyes, the way he stared blankly out the kitchen window into the dark, and the trembling in his hands when the mail arrived bearing the embossed logo of the bank. "We can sell a parcel, Artie," Clara had suggested softly one evening, placing a hand on his shoulder as he sat hunched over a ledger that bled red ink. "Just the North 40. It might be enough to get Croft off our backs." Albert shook his head slowly, the weight of a century of Pendletons pressing down on him. "Croft doesn't want the North 40, Clara. He wants the whole thing. I heard from Robert Higgins over at the county clerk's office. First Agrarian isn't just a bank anymore. They've partnered with a massive commercial real estate developer. They want our land because the state is planning to run the new interstate bypass right along our eastern ridge. If they foreclose, they can flip this farm to the developers for 10 times what the agricultural value is. They set the trap, and I walked right into it. The reality was sickening. The bank hadn't given him the loan to help him farm. They had given him the loan hoping he would fail. 2 days later, the official notice of default arrived via certified mail, delivered by a smirking junior loan officer named David Sterling. Albert had 30 days to produce the outstanding balance of $842,000 in full, or the bank would initiate foreclosure, seize the property, and evict the family. Albert stood on his porch, holding the thick legal envelope. The wind howled across the dying stalks of corn. The bank had all the money, all the lawyers, and all the power. Albert had nothing but a high school education, a failing tractor, and the clothes on his back. But as Albert looked down at the sprawling, intimidating mass of legal jargon in his hands, a strange, quiet resolve settled over him. Harrison Croft and his army of corporate attorneys assumed that a simple dirt farmer wouldn't have the intellect, the patience, or the audacity to fight back on their terms. They assumed he would just pack his bags and leave. Albert turned on his heel, walked back into the house, and headed straight for the attic. He was going to read every single word. The Pendleton attic was a dusty, cavernous space that smelled of dry rot, mothballs, and forgotten history. Rain lashed against the single dormer window as Albert dragged a heavy, iron-clasped lockbox out from beneath a pile of old woolen blankets. Downstairs, the grandfather clock ticked away the precious hours of his 30-day window, but Albert was stepping back in time. If First Agrarian Trust wanted to play a game of contracts and deeds, Albert needed to know exactly what land they were actually claiming to take. He carried the lockbox down to the kitchen table, poured himself a mug of black coffee, and cracked it open. Inside were the original foundational documents of the Pendleton estate, yellowed parchment, brittle to the touch, written in flowing cursive ink. There were property surveys from 1898, tax stamps from the Great War, and the original deed signed by his great-grandfather, Elias Pendleton. For 3 straight days and nights, Albert hardly slept. He sat at the oak kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of paper. On his left were the historical deeds of his ancestors. On his right was the monstrous, 400-page comprehensive collateralization and asset seizure agreement he had signed with First Agrarian Trust. He had a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, a yellow highlighter in his right hand, and a legal pad filled with frantic, scribbled notes. Clara kept the coffee coming, silently watching her husband transform from a defeated man into something resembling a forensic investigator. The bank's contract was a masterpiece of corporate aggression. It was designed to strip a debtor of every conceivable right, loophole, and dignity. It claimed dominion over the structures, the crops, the livestock, and the topsoil. It explicitly waived Albert's right to a jury trial and bound him to expensive, bank-friendly arbitration. It was airtight, or, at least, it was meant to be. On the 4th night, at 2:14 a.m., the farmhouse was dead silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Albert was reading through Appendix G, subsection 14, Subrogation of Historical Land Rights, a boilerplate section buried on page 312 of the bank's contract. Albert stopped. He read the paragraph once. Then he read it again. He put his highlighter down. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. He frantically dug into his pile of historical documents, pulling out an obscure, multi-page addendum dated the 14th of October 1932. It was a document his grandfather, Thomas, had drafted during the height of the Great Depression, when the family was fighting off a different set of bankers. During the 1930s, the federal government had attempted to build a massive reservoir system through Oak Haven Valley, a project that was ultimately abandoned. However, to facilitate the initial surveys, Thomas Pendleton had legally severed the property rights of the farm. He had divided the estate into 2 distinct legal entities, the Surface and Agricultural Dominion and the Subterranean and Hydrological Heritage Trust. Albert laid the 1932 deed next to the bank's 2021 contract. When First Agrarian Trusts overpaid, Ivy League corporate lawyers had drafted Albert's loan. They had been lazy. Because First Agrarian had swallowed up dozens of smaller regional banks, they utilized automated software to pull property descriptions from the digital county tax rolls to generate the collateral boundaries. The digital tax roll only listed the Surface and Agricultural Dominion because the Subterranean Trust hadn't been taxed in 80 years. It was registered as a zero-value historical conservation easement. The bank's contract explicitly stated, in the event of foreclosure, the lender shall seize and assume all liabilities, responsibilities, and ownership of the precise boundaries listed in Schedule A, and accepts the property as is, inheriting all environmental and infrastructural obligations attached to said physical coordinates. But the bank didn't know about the water. Underneath the Pendleton farm sat the Oak Haven Aquifer, but more importantly, the only viable well access point, the massive industrial pumping station that provided water not just to the farm, but served as the primary irrigation pressure point for the entire eastern ridge, the exact ridge the developers wanted to build their highway bypass and commercial subdivisions on, was legally owned by the Subterranean Hydrological Heritage Trust. Albert had pledged his farm as collateral. He had not pledged the Subterranean Trust, because the Subterranean Trust was a separate legal entity, owned by a holding company that Albert was the sole executor of, but that had never been listed on the loan. If the bank foreclosed, they would own 300 acres of dirt and a house, but Albert would still own every drop of water beneath it and the legal rights to the surface footprint where the pumps sat. The bank's contract, in its zealous attempt to force the farmer to give up everything, explicitly stated that the bank assumes all pre-existing easements and access tolls required to maintain the property. Albert let out a low, breathy laugh that bordered on manic. It wasn't just the water, it was the liabilities. He flipped back to the bank's asset seizure liability clause. First Agrarian Trust, attempting to protect itself from farmers intentionally destroying land before leaving, had written, "Upon the execution of the notice of eviction, the foreclosing entity assumes total financial liability for any pre-existing, legally binding biological or ecological stewardship contracts tied to the property, holding the former occupant harmless." Albert stared at the words, biological or ecological stewardship contracts. A plan, so audacious and brilliant that it bordered on madness, began to form in his mind. He wasn't just going to fight the foreclosure, he was going to let them have the farm, and he was going to make them pay him millions for the privilege. The next morning, Albert did not go out to fix the tractor. He did not go out to survey the failing crops. Instead, he showered, put on his only tailored suit, a charcoal wool two-piece he hadn't worn since his daughter's wedding, and drove his beat-up Ford F-150 into town. His first stop was the Oak Haven County Clerk's office to see his old friend, Robert Higgins. Bob was a man in his late 60s who knew where every metaphorical body in the county was buried. Albert pulled Bob into a back room, away from the prying ears of the junior clerks. He unrolled the 1,932 Subterranean Trust deed and a newly drafted, legally binding stewardship contract. Bob adjusted his thick glasses, reading over the documents. As his eyes scanned the pages, his jaw slowly dropped. He looked up at Albert, a mixture of awe and sheer terror in his eyes. "Albert, you realize what this is?" Bob whispered, tapping the paper. "You're establishing a 50-year, irrevocable ecological stewardship lease on the surface footprint of the wellheads. And you're assigning the contract to, who is this? Pendleton Heritage Conservancy LLC. I registered the LLC in Delaware online last night," Albert said calmly. "It's fully insulated. The LLC holds the exclusive rights to cultivate and maintain a highly sensitive, endangered botanical species precisely on the 3 acres surrounding the water pumps. The contract states that if the landowner disrupts the cultivation or fails to provide unrestricted water access, the penalty is a multi-million-dollar breach of contract, payable immediately. And because the bank's own foreclosure fine print says they assume all pre-existing stewardship contracts as is when they take the deed." Bob trailed off, doing the math in his head. "Exactly," Albert smiled. "They want the farm. I'm going to give it to them. But the second they take the title, they inherit a legally binding obligation to pay my LLC $15,000 a day in water access and cultivation disruption tolls if they so much as move a rock near those pumps. If they try to build their commercial subdivision, they'll have to bulldoze my protected easement. The buyout clause to terminate the stewardship contract early is set at exactly $4 million. It's a poison pill," Bob breathed, laughing quietly. "Albert, it's brilliant. But if they find out before the 30 days are up, they'll halt the foreclosure and drag you into court for fraud." "It's not fraud, Bob," Albert replied, his voice hardening. "It's the free market. It's the exact same ruthless, fine-print capitalism they've been using to bleed families like mine dry for decades. I'm just playing by their rules. Can you file the easement and the lease today, quietly? I'll have it time-stamped and buried in the digital registry by noon," Bob promised, shaking Albert's hand firmly. Over the next 3 weeks, Albert's behavior became the talk of Oak Haven. Instead of packing his belongings or holding a tearful estate sale, Albert hired a local crew to build a massive, 10-foot-high chain-link fence around a seemingly random 3-acre patch of dirt right in the middle of his property. He plastered it with menacing federal protected ecological cultivation zone signs. He bought hundreds of pounds of exotic, certified organic soil and began meticulously planting row upon row of an incredibly rare, legally protected strain of indigenous prairie grass. When David Sterling, the arrogant junior loan officer from First Agrarian, drove by to check on the property, he rolled down his window and sneered at Albert, who was covered in mud, kneeling inside the fence. "Wasting your last few days playing in the dirt, old man," Sterling called out from the comfort of his leather seats. "You have exactly 6 days left to vacate. We've already got the developers coming in next week to survey the land for the new highway off-ramp. Don't leave a mess." Albert stood up, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked slowly to the fence. He looked David Sterling dead in the eyes, his expression completely unreadable. "I've read your contract, Mr. Sterling," Albert said softly. "I suggest you go back to Chicago and advise Mr. Croft to do the same." Sterling scoffed, rolling up his window and speeding off, kicking up a cloud of dust. He thought Albert was just another broken farmer, losing his mind under the pressure. He had no idea that a meticulously armed legal landmine was ticking beneath his tires. The final day of the 30-day notice arrived. The trap was set. Now, Albert just had to wait for the bank to pull the trigger. The morning of the eviction was bitterly cold, the sky the color of bruised iron. Frost clung to the dead stalks of the cornfields, waiting for a sun that refused to break through the cloud cover. At precisely 8 a.m., a convoy of vehicles turned down the dirt driveway of the Pendleton farm. Leading the pack was the familiar silver German sedan belonging to Harrison Croft, followed by a local sheriff's cruiser, and finally, a massive flatbed truck carrying a yellow Caterpillar D9 bulldozer. First Agrarian Trust was not just taking possession of the property, they were making a statement. Croft stepped out of his car, adjusting the collar of his cashmere overcoat against the biting wind. David Sterling, the junior loan officer, flanked him, clutching a leather binder stuffed with execution orders. They were joined by a new figure, Richard Gable, the CEO of Apex Horizon Group, the commercial development firm that had already quietly inked a $60 million contingent purchase agreement for the Pendleton land. Gable was a man who viewed the world entirely in terms of square footage and profit margins, and he was eager to break ground on the new highway bypass infrastructure. They expected a standoff. They expected Albert Pendleton to be barricaded inside, clutching a shotgun and a bottle of cheap whiskey. Instead, they found the front door of the farmhouse wide open. Sheriff Miller, a man who had known Albert since high school and looked physically ill at having to participate in this, stepped onto the groaning wooden porch. "Albert," he called out, his hand resting hesitantly on his radio. "Albert, it's Tom Miller. We have to execute the writ." There was no answer. The house was entirely empty. Albert and Clara had packed their personal belongings, family photo albums, and the lockbox of historical documents the night before. They had driven away in their rusted Ford F-150, leaving the keys on the kitchen counter next to a perfectly brewed, steaming pot of coffee and a single, neatly typed envelope addressed to Harrison Croft. Sterling marched into the kitchen, his polished dress shoes echoing loudly on the scuffed linoleum. He snatched the envelope off the counter and handed it to Croft. "Looks like the old man finally found his senses and ran," Sterling sneered. "Saved us the legal fees of a forced extraction." Croft tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was an invoice. To First Agrarian Trust, current deed holder of 440, 2 Oak Haven Ridge, from Pendleton Heritage Conservancy, LLC, for Day 1 Ecological Cultivation, Disruption Toll and Water Access Maintenance. Amount due, $15,000. Terms, payable within 30 days. Late fees compound at 8% weekly. Croft frowned, turning the paper over as if expecting a punchline on the back. What the hell is this? Some kind of sovereign citizen nonsense? He crumpled the paper and tossed it onto the empty counter. "Ignore it. The property is ours. Gable, you can start the preliminary grading on the Eastern Ridge immediately." Gable nodded to his site foreman, a burly man named Peterson, who signaled the flatbed driver to unload the bulldozer. The massive diesel engine roared to life, coughing a plume of black smoke into the crisp morning air. The heavy steel treads tore into the frozen dirt, leaving deep, violent scars in the earth that had been carefully tilled by 4 generations of Pendletons. The bulldozer lumbered toward the center of the property, aiming for the slight elevation where the heavy-duty irrigation pumps were housed. Gable's plan was to level the pumping station first, capping the well to stabilize the ground for the heavy concrete footings required by the bypass off-ramp. But as the bulldozer crested the small hill, Peterson raised his hand, signaling the operator to cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. Croft, Sterling, and Gable trudged up the hill, their expensive shoes sinking into the mud. "What's the holdup?" Gable barked. "We are on a strict timeline, Peterson." Peterson simply pointed. Standing before them, completely enclosing the 3 acres that housed the industrial water pumps, was a 10-foot-high, heavy-gauge chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Every 20 feet, a bright red, federally mandated sign was zip-tied to the metal links. Warning: Protected Ecological Cultivation Zone. Authorized personnel only. Unauthorized disruption subject to severe civil penalties and fines. Inside the fence, the ground had been meticulously manicured. Precise rows of delicate, pale green shoots were pushing through the imported, nutrient-rich soil. It looked like a high-security botanical garden dropped into the middle of a barren, dying cornfield. "What in God's name is this?" Croft demanded, his face flushing red with sudden, inexplicable anger. "It's a fence, Mr. Croft," Sterling said, trying to sound dismissive. "Pendleton must have put it up last week. I saw him playing in the dirt over here. It's a desperate delay tactic. Tear it down," Gable ordered Peterson. "Rip the whole damn thing out. I want those pumps capped by noon." Peterson, however, did not move. He walked slowly to the fence, squinting at one of the smaller white placards bolted beneath the red warning signs. He read the text aloud, his voice carrying over the desolate field. "Property of Pendleton Heritage Conservancy, LLC. This plot is under an active, legally binding 50-year ecological stewardship lease, recorded with the Oakhaven County Clerk. Cultivation of the endangered Panicum virgatum varietal in progress. Any physical disruption, vibration, or alteration of the soil composition by the surface deed holder constitutes an immediate breach of contract." Peterson turned to Gable, crossing his massive arms. "Mr. Gable, I don't care what the bank told you. I've been running heavy machinery for 30 years. You don't mess with federal ecological zones, and you sure as hell don't bulldoze a registered conservation easement without clearance from the EPA and the county. If I drive that cat through that fence, my company loses its operating license, and I go to jail. Call your lawyers." Croft's stomach performed a sudden, violent drop. He remembered the crumpled invoice on the kitchen counter. $15,000. "Sterling," Croft snapped, his voice tight. "Get Beatrice Montgomery on the phone. Now." Beatrice Montgomery was the senior partner of corporate litigation at First Agrarian Trust's Chicago headquarters. She was a woman who dismantled opposing legal teams with the cold, surgical precision of a coroner. When Croft's frantic call came through, she immediately pulled a team of paralegals to comb through the Oakhaven County digital and physical registries. 6 hours later, Croft and Sterling were sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of the local First Agrarian branch office. The air was thick with tension. The speakerphone in the center of the polished table chimed. "Harrison." Beatrice's voice crackled through the speaker, devoid of any pleasantries. "What exactly did you do?" "We executed a standard foreclosure, Beatrice," Croft defended himself, loosening his silk tie. "The farmer defaulted. We took the deed. Now there's some kind of fake fence and a bogus botanical company trying to extort us." "It is not a fake fence, Harrison, and it is most certainly not a bogus company," Beatrice replied, the ice in her tone causing Sterling to physically flinch. "I have just spent the last 4 hours reviewing the physical filings at the county clerk's office. 3 weeks prior to your foreclosure execution, Albert Pendleton, acting as the executor of the Subterranean and Hydrological Heritage Trust, leased the surface access rights of the wellhead to a Delaware-registered entity named Pendleton Heritage Conservancy, LLC. So invalidate the lease," Croft demanded. "He used the land as collateral for his loan. He didn't have the right to lease it out. That is where you are catastrophically wrong," Beatrice said. "I am looking at the original loan origination documents your office drafted, Harrison. Because your team used an automated software pull from the digital tax rolls, you only collateralized the surface and agricultural dominion. You failed to capture the Subterranean Trust, which was severed from the surface deed in 1932. Pendleton owned the water, and the surface access footprint to that water free and clear. He had every legal right to lease it to whomever he pleased." Silence fell over the conference room. Sterling looked like he was going to be sick. "But it gets worse," Beatrice continued, delivering the fatal blow. "When you executed the foreclosure this morning, you triggered Appendix G, subsection 14 of our own standard collateralization contract, the Asset Seizure Liability Clause." Croft felt the blood drain from his face. He knew the clause. He was the one who had mandated it be included in all regional agricultural loans. The clause states, Beatrice read, her voice dripping with venom, "Upon execution of the notice of eviction, the foreclosing entity assumes total financial liability for any pre-existing, legally binding biological or ecological stewardship contracts tied to the property, holding the former occupant harmless. You wrote that clause, Harrison, to stop angry farmers from dumping motor oil on the fields or burning the barns before they were evicted. You wanted to make sure the bank wasn't liable for their mess. Yes, Croft whispered. Well, Albert Pendleton read it. And he used it against you. By taking the deed today, First Agrarian Trust legally assumed the position of the landlord in Pendleton's pre-existing stewardship lease. You are now legally bound to protect his LLC's grass. It's just grass. Sterling suddenly burst out, his panic overriding his common sense. We can just pay him off. What is a plot of dirt worth? $5,000? Did either of you bother to read the breach of contract penalties recorded in the county registry? Beatrice asked. No, Croft admitted quietly. We just saw the fence. The lease stipulates that the landowner, which is now First Agrarian Trust, must provide unrestricted access to the water pumps and ensure zero physical disruption to the 3 acres. If the landowner fails to do so, or attempts to evict the LLC, they are subject to a daily disruption toll of $15,000. Furthermore, if the landowner wishes to terminate the 50-year lease prematurely, there is a fixed, non-negotiable buyout clause. Beatrice paused, letting the silence hang in the air like a guillotine blade. $4 million, she said. If you touch that fence, or if you try to sell that land to Richard Gable's development firm without clearing the easement, Pendleton's LLC will drag us into federal court, and they will win. He used our own predatory boilerplate language to build a flawless, legally impenetrable fortress around his water supply. Croft stared blankly at the polished mahogany table. He had spent his entire career trapping desperate people in mazes of legal jargon and fine print. Now, he found himself utterly trapped in a maze designed by a man who drove a 20-year-old tractor and wore overalls. We fight it, Croft finally said, desperation creeping into his voice. We tie him up in litigation. We bleed him out with legal fees. He's a broke dirt farmer. He can't afford to fight First Agrarian Trust. Harrison, are you truly this blind? Beatrice snapped. He doesn't have to fight us. He's not suing us. We are the ones bleeding out. Every day that fence sits there, and every day you delay Gable's development, it costs this bank money. The LLC is registered in Delaware. It's shielded. He filed the paperwork flawlessly. If we take this to court, it will become a matter of public record. Do you know what the press will do with this? Megabank outsmarted by local farmer using their own fine print. Our stock will take a hit. Our reputation in the agricultural sector will be decimated. Every farmer in the Midwest will start scrutinizing their contracts looking for loopholes. So what do you suggest we do? Croft asked, his voice barely a whisper. You are going to get in your car, Beatrice ordered. You are going to find Albert Pendleton, and you are going to ask him very nicely how he would prefer his check to be delivered. Albert Pendleton was sitting on the back patio of a modest, single-story rental house on the outskirts of town. Clara was inside, unpacking their kitchen supplies, humming a quiet tune that Albert hadn't heard her sing in 3 years. The weight that had crushed his chest for the last 36 months was completely gone, replaced by a profound, terrifying lightness. He was holding a cup of tea when the silver German sedan pulled up to the curb. Harrison Croft walked up the short concrete driveway. He looked older than he had that morning. The swagger, the sterile corporate arrogance, had evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked like he had just survived a shipwreck. He didn't bring Sterling with him this time. Albert didn't stand up. He merely gestured to the empty aluminum lawn chair across the small patio table. Have a seat, Mr. Croft. Can Clara get you anything? We don't have the fancy espresso machine from your office, but the drip coffee is fresh. Croft sat down stiffly, refusing the offer. He looked at Albert, really looked at him, for the first time. He didn't see a naive victim anymore. He saw a man who possessed a lethal, quiet intelligence. You knew, Croft said, his voice stripped of all its former smooth jargon. When you sat in my office and begged for that bridge loan, you knew about the Subterranean Trust. I did, Albert replied smoothly, taking a sip of his tea. My grandfather severed the water rights during the Depression to keep the local bankers from stealing the aquifer. I just kept the paperwork updated. And the grass? Croft asked, a hint of bitter respect creeping into his tone. The endangered botanical species. Albert smiled gently. Panicum virgatum, switchgrass. Technically, it is native to the prairie ecosystem, and the specific strain I planted is categorized as sensitive by the State Conservation Board. It requires very specific soil pH and absolutely zero heavy vibrations to take root. It's a very demanding plant, Mr. Croft. It needs a lot of peace and quiet, which is why the $15,000 daily penalty for construction noise seemed quite reasonable. Croft let out a slow, exhausted breath. Richard Gable called me an hour ago. He brought his own lawyers in to look at the county registry. He's furious. He can't build his highway bypass if he can't cap those wells. And he can't build his commercial subdivisions if he doesn't have the water rights to supply them. Without your 3 acres, the other 297 acres of the farm are functionally useless to him. He's threatening to pull out of the $60 million purchase agreement by Friday. That sounds like a terribly stressful situation for your bank, Albert said, his tone perfectly even, projecting absolute empathy mixed with complete indifference. We are willing to make a settlement, Croft said, pulling a sleek leather checkbook from his breast pocket. The bank realizes that the transition of the property was handled poorly. We are prepared to offer Pendleton Heritage Conservancy LLC $500,000 to terminate the stewardship lease and surrender the subterranean trust. Albert set his teacup down on the table. The sharp clink of the porcelain cut through the quiet neighborhood. Mr. Croft, when I missed my first payment by 30 days, I came to your office. I asked you for a grace period. I asked you to let me restructure the debt so I could keep the farm my family bled for. Do you remember what you told me? Croft swallowed hard, looking away. You told me, Albert continued, his voice dropping an octave, cold and precise. Standard operating procedure, Mr. Pendleton. The fine print is absolute. We do not negotiate against our own contracts. You looked at me like I was a spreadsheet error. Albert leaned forward, locking eyes with the banking executive. I am not a spreadsheet error, Harrison. I am the man who holds the keys to your $60 million deal. You wrote the contract. You demanded I sign it. You set the rules of this game. I am just holding you to them. The buyout clause in the lease is $4 million, not a penny less. And every day you sit in this lawn chair trying to negotiate, another $15,000 gets added to your tab. Croft stared at Albert. He saw no bluff, no hesitation, no opening for leverage. Albert had him backed against a wall of the bank's own making. If First Agrarian Trust didn't pay the $4 million, they would lose the $60 million development deal, and they would be stuck holding 300 acres of dead farmland that they couldn't even walk across without triggering a federal lawsuit. Slowly, his hands shaking slightly, Croft put his checkbook back in his pocket. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder containing the corporate release forms Beatrice Montgomery had drawn up. $4 million, Croft whispered. Paid in full via wire transfer by close of business tomorrow, in exchange for the immediate dissolution of the LLC and the transfer of the subterranean trust, and the cancellation of my outstanding agricultural debt, Albert added smoothly. I won't have a foreclosure on my credit report. You will classify the transition of the property as a mutually agreed asset acquisition. I want my name cleared. Croft closed his eyes, the defeat absolute. Fine. Mutually agreed, asset acquisition. It will be drafted by morning. Croft stood up, the weight of the massive corporate loss pressing down on his shoulders. He looked down at the farmer who had beaten an army of Chicago lawyers with nothing but a highlighter and a dusty box of family history. You're a ruthless man, Mr. Pendleton, Croft said quietly. Albert stood up, his posture straight, his weathered face reflecting the pride of his ancestors. No, Mr. Croft, I'm just a farmer who learned how to read. You gentlemen have a safe drive back to the city. The digital readout on Albert Pendleton's battered smartphone seemed entirely incongruous with the cracked screen and the grease smudges on the case. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 24 hours after Harrison Croft had sat on his patio. Albert was sitting at the laminate kitchen table of their rental house, a half-eaten piece of dry toast resting on a paper plate. He tapped the screen to refresh the local credit union app. The little blue circle spun for a fraction of a second. Available balance: $4,218.42. Albert stared at the screen for a long time. The $2,118 were the remnants of his life savings, the absolute bottom of the barrel after fighting First Agrarian Trust for 3 years. The $4 million was the blood money. It was the price of his family's legacy, ransomed back from a corporation that had intended to steal it for pennies. Clara walked into the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at Albert's face, which was frozen in a mask of quiet contemplation. Did it happen, Artie? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might cause the numbers to vanish. It cleared, Albert said, setting the phone face down on the table. The bank held up their end. Bob Higgins just texted me, too. The corporate release forms were filed at the courthouse at 8 this morning. The mutually agreed asset acquisition is public record. My name is clear. The debt is gone. Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding since 2021. She walked up behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. resting her chin against his temple. "We're free," she murmured. "We can buy a nice place out in Wyoming. Or Montana. Somewhere they don't build highway bypasses." Albert reached up and placed his rough, calloused hand over hers. "We aren't going to Wyoming, Clara. And we aren't going to Montana." Clara pulled back slightly, looking down at him with furrowed brows. "Artie, we don't have a farm anymore. The bank owns Oak Haven Ridge. What else is there for us here?" Albert turned his chair around to face his wife. The exhaustion that had aged him 10 years in the span of 3 seemed to have entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp energy that Clara had only ever seen when a devastating freeze threatened a harvest, and Albert had to work 48 hours straight to save the crops. "First Agrarian Trust bought our 300 acres because Richard Gable needs them for the highway bypass infrastructure," Albert explained, his voice low and deliberate. "But Gable's company, Apex Horizon Group, isn't just building a highway off-ramp. You don't spend $60 million on rural land just to build a road." I looked up Apex's zoning petitions with the State Transportation Board last night. Albert stood up, walking over to the small window that looked out over the sprawling, flat expanse of the Nebraska landscape. "They are planning a massive commercial and residential subdivision. 600 luxury homes, a strip mall, a logistics warehouse. They are going to pave over the entire eastern half of the county. But to do that, Gable needs more than just my 300 acres. He needs a contiguous block of 2,000 acres to get the zoning permits approved by the state." Clara's eyes widened as she followed his logic. "He needs the neighboring farms." "Exactly," Albert nodded. "He needs William Cole's place to the south. He needs Thomas Bradley's dairy pastures to the east. And he needs the old Henderson tract. And do you know who holds the primary agricultural mortgages on every single one of those properties?" "First Agrarian Trust," Clara breathed. "Croft and his army of lawyers think they solved their problem by paying me off," Albert said, a hard, humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth. "They think I was a localized infection that they cured with a checkbook, but they don't understand how farmers talk, Clara. Cole is 3 months behind on his payments. Bradley is drowning in feed debt. The bank is systematically starving them out so they can foreclose, seize the deeds, and hand the entire valley over to Gable on a silver platter." Albert picked his phone back up, looking at the $4 million balance. It was more money than any Pendleton had ever possessed in the history of their bloodline. To anyone else, it was a ticket to a luxury retirement, a beachfront condo, an escape. To Albert Pendleton, it was ammunition. "Croft told me I was a ruthless man," Albert said quietly, sliding the phone into his denim pocket. "I'm going to show him exactly what that means. I need to make a phone call to Samuel Jenkins." Samuel Jenkins was not a corporate heavyweight. He didn't wear Italian suits or work out of a glass skyscraper in Chicago. Jenkins operated out of a converted brick storefront next to the Oak Haven post office. He was a rural estate attorney who spent most of his time drafting wills for aging farmers and fighting petty boundary disputes. But Jenkins possessed a mind like a steel trap and a deep, abiding hatred for the predatory banking conglomerates that were hollowing out his town. When Albert sat in Jenkins's cramped office an hour later and laid out his plan, the attorney actually dropped his pen. "Albert, you are talking about engaging in hostile corporate debt acquisition," Jenkins said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You are a farmer. This is Wall Street hedge fund territory." "It's just paper, Sam," Albert replied evenly. "First Agrarian Trust is currently holding roughly $12 million in distressed, non-performing agricultural loans across the 5 properties bordering my old farm. Those loans are toxic assets on the bank's regional ledger. Harrison Croft's division just took a $4 million unbudgeted loss on my settlement. His superiors in Chicago are going to be demanding he balance his books for the fiscal quarter." Jenkins leaned back in his creaking leather chair, the gears in his head turning rapidly. "You want to buy your neighbor's debt?" "I don't want to buy it," Albert corrected him. "I want a blind proxy LLC to buy it. If First Agrarian sees my name on anything, they'll burn the paperwork. We set up an anonymous holding company, let's call it the Great Plains Reclamation Fund. We approach First Agrarian's distressed asset division through a shell broker in Omaha. We offer to purchase the non-performing loans of Cole, Bradley, and the others for 20 cents on the dollar. The bank gets an immediate infusion of cash to patch the hole I blew in their quarterly earnings, and they offload their toxic risk. And then you own the mortgages," Jenkins said, awe bleeding into his voice. "You become the bank, and once I am the bank," Albert said, his eyes hard as flint, "I restructure their loans. I drop the interest rates to 0. I forgive the late fees. I give William and Thomas a 10-year grace period. They get to keep their land, and Gable gets locked out of the valley permanently. Can you build the holding company, Sam?" Jenkins stared at the stoic farmer across his desk, He was witnessing a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. "I'll have the paperwork filed in Delaware by tomorrow morning," Jenkins said, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Let's go shopping." 400 miles away, in the gleaming, sterile executive suites of First Agrarian Trust in Chicago, Harrison Croft was enduring the worst week of his professional life. The $4 million payout to Albert Pendleton had been hidden deep within the quarterly expense reports under miscellaneous legal resolutions, but a hemorrhage of that size did not go unnoticed by the senior executive board. Beatrice Montgomery had insulated herself brilliantly, providing paper trails proving she had only advised on the fallout, leaving Croft to take the full, unmitigated blame for the botched collateralization contract. Croft was currently standing in front of the regional vice president's desk, sweating through his expensive shirt. "We salvaged the Apex Horizon deal," Croft argued desperately, pointing to the sprawling architectural blueprints rolled out on the table. "Gable has his 300 acres. He has the water access. He's breaking ground on the bypass infrastructure next week. The $60 million transaction is secure." The vice president, a ruthless man named Sterling Vance, no relation to David, looked at Croft with eyes like two chips of ice. "You secured the anchor, Harrison, but Gable just called me this morning. Apex Horizon is ready to trigger the secondary purchase clauses for the surrounding 2,000 acres. He wants the Cole property, the Bradley Dairy Farm, and the Henderson Tract to begin grading for the residential subdivisions." "That shouldn't be a problem," Croft said quickly, eager to provide good news. "Those properties are all severely delinquent. We hold the primary paper. I can initiate blanket foreclosures by Friday. We can seize the entire block and have the deeds ready for Gable in 45 days. The vice president slowly steepled his fingers, his silence heavy and suffocating. "You cannot initiate foreclosures, Harrison, because we do not hold the paper on those properties anymore." Croft blinked, momentarily losing his cognitive footing. "What do you mean we don't hold the paper? Those are prime Oakhaven assets. They've been on our distressed ledger for 2 years. "They were on our distressed ledger," the vice president corrected sharply. 3 weeks ago, to cover the massive, embarrassing $4 million deficit you created in your regional budget, your own distressed asset division sold off a bundle of non-performing rural mortgages to an anonymous private equity firm out of Omaha called the Great Plains Reclamation Fund. You authorized the sale, Harrison. You signed the release to get the cash injection before the quarterly audit." Croft felt the floor seemingly drop away from beneath his feet. He had authorized a bulk sale of toxic loans. Yes. It was standard practice. Sell the bad debt for pennies on the dollar to debt collectors to clean up the books. He hadn't bothered to check the specific addresses of the farms in the bundle. To him, they were just account numbers, red ink to be erased. "Who is the Great Plains Reclamation Fund?" Croft asked, his voice trembling. "We don't know," the vice president snapped. "They are a blind proxy registered in Delaware. But whoever they are, they just completely outmaneuvered us." Gable's acquisition team reached out to the farmers yesterday with lowball buyout offers, expecting them to be desperate. Instead, the farmers laughed in their faces. Their mortgages have been completely restructured by this new fund. They have zero interest, no balloon payments, and absolute security. They are refusing to sell to Apex Horizon. Croft's mind raced, desperately trying to assemble the jagged pieces of the puzzle. An anonymous fund, a sudden influx of capital, a laser-focused acquisition of the specific farms surrounding the Pendleton property. A cold, creeping dread began to pool in Croft's stomach. He remembered Albert Pendleton sitting calmly on his patio, sipping tea. "I am just a farmer who learned how to read." "Sir," Croft said, his throat tight. "I need to go back to Oakhaven." Meanwhile, in the valley, the mood had shifted from a funeral dirge to a quiet, jubilant revolution. Albert sat at the head of a long, battered oak table in the basement of the Oakhaven Community Center. Around him sat William Cole, Thomas Bradley, and 4 other local farmers whose families had worked the ridge for generations. They were men with dirt under their fingernails and deep lines of worry etched into their faces. But tonight, there was a spark of disbelief and hope in their eyes. Samuel Jenkins stood at the front of the room, handing out thick stacks of legal documents. "Gentlemen," Jenkins announced, tapping the papers, "what you are holding are the newly restructured deeds of trust for your properties. As of this morning, the Great Plains Reclamation Fund holds your mortgages. Your interest rates have been permanently fixed at 0%. Your late penalties have been completely erased. As long as you maintain the land for agricultural use, you cannot be foreclosed upon." William Cole, a man who had been 3 weeks away from losing the farm his grandfather built, stared at the paper, a single tear cutting a track through the dust on his cheek. He looked across the table at Albert. "Albert, I don't understand. The bank just sold our debt? Why would this fund do this for us? Who are they? Albert leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. He didn't smile. This wasn't a game. It was a war. And they had just won a major battle. There is no anonymous hedge fund, William, Albert said quietly. First Agrarian Trust paid me $4 million to surrender my land so they could give it to the developers. I took their money, formed an LLC, and bought your debt out from under them. I am the Great Plains Reclamation Fund. Stunned silence echoed through the basement. Thomas Bradley dropped his pen. You bought our mortgages? Thomas whispered. With the bank's own money? I did, Albert confirmed. First Agrarian tried to break this community apart piece by piece. They used fine print, predatory interest, and corporate leverage to force us out so they could pave over our heritage. But they made a mistake. They gave me the capital to fight back. I now hold the paper on 2,000 contiguous acres of Oakhaven Ridge, and I am never selling to Richard Gable. So, what happens now? William asked, looking at Albert with a mixture of reverence and awe. Now, Albert said, standing up, we form the Oakhaven Agricultural Syndicate. I am transferring the holding company into a cooperative trust. Every farmer in this room gets an equal voting share. The land stays in our hands forever. The developers can have my 300 acres to build their highway off-ramp, but they will never build their luxury subdivision because they are completely surrounded by an impenetrable fortress of protected farmland. The autumn wind had given way to the bitter, freezing bite of deep winter by the time Richard Gable and Harrison Croft returned to Oakhaven. Apex Horizon Group had successfully leveled the Pendleton farmhouse and capped the subterranean water pumps. The 300 acres were now a flat, lifeless expanse of frozen mud, prepped for the highway infrastructure, but without the surrounding 2,000 acres to build the residential subdivisions and commercial centers, the $60 million land acquisition was a catastrophic failure. The State Transportation Board was threatening to pull the highway contract entirely if Apex couldn't guarantee the economic development of the surrounding zone. Gable's silver Maybach pulled to a stop at the boundary line of the former Pendleton farm. The asphalt road ended abruptly, transitioning into the frozen dirt of William Cole's property. Standing exactly on the property line, wearing a heavy canvas coat and a wool cap, was Albert Pendleton. Flanking him were William Cole, Thomas Bradley, and Samuel Jenkins. Gable stepped out of his luxury vehicle, his face purple with rage and the biting cold. Croft trailed behind him, looking like a man walking to his own execution. Pendleton, Gable barked, marching up to the property line but instinctively stopping an inch short of crossing it. This is cute. You think playing a shell game with some distressed debt makes you a real estate mogul. I have a team of corporate litigators in Chicago drafting an antitrust lawsuit right now. You are illegally blocking commercial development. There's nothing illegal about a private entity purchasing non-performing loans, Mr. Gable. Samuel Jenkins intervened smoothly, stepping forward with a briefcase. It's the very foundation of the free market. You wanted to buy the land. My client bought the debt first. He outbid you. With my bank's money, Croft suddenly shouted, his composure shattering. You weaponized our own settlement against us. Albert looked at Croft, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. I utilized the capital provided by a mutually agreed asset acquisition, Harrison, just as you utilized the fine print of my collateralization contract to try and steal my family's legacy. You taught me that in business, morality is irrelevant compared to the leverage of a binding contract. I was an excellent student. Gable pushed past Croft, glaring at Albert. Every man has a number, Pendleton. You proved that when you took the $4 million. So, what's the number for the rest of the valley? I'll double the value of the mortgages. I'll write you a check for $20 million right now for the holding company. It was a staggering sum of money. $20 million. It was enough to buy a private island. Croft watched Albert's face, expecting to see the inevitable glint of greed. Instead, Albert slowly shook his head. You still don't understand, Mr. Gable, Albert said, his voice carrying clearly over the howling winter wind. When I took the $4 million, I was fighting for survival. I traded my dirt to save my family. But this? He gestured to the vast, rolling fields of the Cole and Bradley farms stretching out behind him. This isn't my dirt to sell. This is the Oakhaven Agricultural Syndicate. It's a cooperative trust, legally bound in perpetuity. Albert pulled a single, folded document from his coat pocket and handed it across the property line to Gable. I transferred ownership of the Great Plains Reclamation Fund into the syndicate last week. I am just one voting member out of 6. And the charter of the syndicate, which was drafted by Mr. Jenkins and filed with the state Supreme Court, explicitly forbids the sale, lease, or commercial rezoning of any constituent lands for a period of 100 years. Gable unfolded the document. His eyes darted across the dense legal text. The blood slowly drained from his face as the reality of his situation crystallized. There was no loophole. There was no buyout clause. Albert Pendleton had permanently, irrevocably locked 2,000 acres of prime real estate into an untouchable agricultural conservation trust. "You're a madman," Gable whispered, staring at the farmer. "You turned down $20 million to freeze in the mud." "I turned down $20 million," Albert corrected him, "to ensure that my neighbor's grandchildren will have a place to plant their corn." "You own a 300-acre island of mud, Mr. Gable. You can build your highway off-ramp, but it's going to lead to absolutely nowhere." Albert turned his back on the billionaire developer and the broken banking executive. He walked back toward William Cole's farmhouse, where Clara was waiting with a pot of hot coffee and a warm fire. He walked with a slight limp, his joints aching from decades of hard labor, but his spine was perfectly straight. Harrison Croft stood on the frozen mud of the ruined farm, watching Albert walk away. His career was over. The $60 million deal was dead. First Agrarian Trust was going to be the laughingstock of the financial world. He looked down at the icy dirt, realizing with crushing finality that he had never really understood the value of the ground beneath his feet. He had only ever seen the price tag. The story of the Oak Haven Syndicate became a quiet legend in the Midwest, a ghost story whispered in corporate boardrooms and celebrated in dusty rural diners. First Agrarian Trust absorbed massive financial casualties, eventually divesting its regional agricultural holdings entirely after the public humiliation cratered its stock value. Richard Gable's luxury subdivision was never built. The Grand Highway off-ramp stands today as a bizarre, lonely loop of concrete, leading directly into an ocean of protected, thriving green corn. Albert and Clara Pendleton didn't buy a mansion. They bought a modest, sturdy farmhouse on the edge of the syndicate lands, watching their neighbors prosper free from the shadow of corporate debt. Albert remained a man of few words, preferring the hum of a tractor to the roar of a crowd. But whenever a sleek black town car mistakenly drove down his dirt road, he was always sitting on the porch, waiting with a devastating, quiet smile.